Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Hi, I'm Caitlin Van Mall, host of I Survived. If you enjoy I Survived, we are excited to announce a new launch. Starting November 15th, we'll be reposting our classic episodes from Season 1 of I Survived. We hope to reach a whole new audience with these important stories of survival. And for those of you who have been with us since the beginning, we think these powerful episodes warrant another listen. Starting November 15th, look out for those episodes and more news from I Survived.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we conclude our look at the trial of Ralph Stokes. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, with my sick co-host, Alice. And I mean that in the best way, Alice.
Because finally, Brett, after all these years of recording, instead of you being sick, now I'm the one who's sick.
Oh, how the worm has turned. It's true. I don't wish it on anybody. I'm sorry, Alice.
Well,
if I could take it for you, I would.
You know what, though? It was coming back from West Palm Beach where we got to hang out with our awesome fans, so it was worth it.
It was worth it. I blame them, though. It was probably their fault.
It definitely wasn't. We met outside, and everyone was...
True.
It definitely wasn't their fault. I think it was the plane. But it's okay.
It probably was the plane. The plane is the most likely thing. But, you know, look, this, once again, testament. Alice... She is fighting through. I kept telling her, we don't have to do this, don't have to do this. And she's like, no, we must. So we're going to see how this goes.
Well,
if Alice starts, speaking in tongues at some point, we'll know something went wrong.
I am a little loopy. I'm on it's just a cold. I'm fine. But I do sound stuffed up. So, nobody comment about how the female co-host has a nasal voice.
I know
they will. But now you guys are in the know and you get to laugh.
Exactly. Well, since you were not feeling great, I think we should just dive right in. We got a lot to talk about. We're going to try and finish today. We'll see if we can. Let's go for it.
I think we can do it because we are nearing the end. Last time we talked about Ralph Stokes' mom and dad testifying and neighbors. There's one more person in his family as well who testified, and that's Reuben, Ralph's teenage brother. I think he was about 15 years old. Now, Reuben testified that the shoes in the bathroom soaking, remember the cops found shoes soaking with like Clorox or something, were actually his. So not Ralph's, but Reuben's. Reuben said that he put those shoes in the pan to soak because they were dirty. He said to his knowledge there was no barbecue sauce on them when he put them in there to soak. He also testified that the blue ski suit that the police seized was his. As for the shoes, he said that he wore a 9.5 and his brother wore a 10.5 or 11. Now, on cross-examination, there was a bit of a glove don't fit kind of moment. Ralph's brother said at the time that he wore a size 10. The prosecution produced the sneakers. Always be careful when you start talking about sizes because remember, the evidence can be there and they can take it out, and they did in this instance, and had him try the shoes on. Now, they didn't know what size the shoes were. They literally just pulled out the shoes that they found soaking and said, all right, Reuben, if these are yours, put them on. Reuben put the shoes on that the prosecution procured, and he claimed that they were tight. So the prosecution had him walk around.
And, this is one of those situations where if they're tight on Reuben, who only wears a 10 at this point, he's grown a little bit, I guess, and his brother's a 10.5 or 11, I mean, that's an important point, right? These are supposedly the shoes he wore to go out and commit a murder, and yet they don't actually fit. If the shoes don't fit, you must have quit, right? I mean, I feel like if this had been 15 years later, the defense attorney totally would have pulled that out. But he didn't have that. And it's interesting because in this case, the prosecution has Reuben put the shoes on, not Ralph. They could have asked Ralph to do it. It's not you can't be forced to testify against yourself, but something like that is not testimonial. So just like they could make OJ put on the gloves, they could have asked for Ralph to put on the shoes, but they do Reuben instead. And I don't know. I think this is kind of interesting. I wonder what people out there think about this. I remember when my wife and I got married, we went to London and Ireland for our honeymoon, and we went to see Les Mis while we were in London. But unfortunately, my luggage had been lost, so I didn't actually have any clothes. So I went out and we bought clothes in London for me to wear to this show, but the store did not have any shoes in my size. They only had shoes that were about a size smaller. And I forced my feet into those things, but let me tell you, that was painful. It was painful all night long with those shoes, cutting the circulation off to my feet. And I don't really know why Ralph would wear these shoes. I mean, it actually doesn't make much sense. Like, why? You're thinking through sort of strategic reasons for this, but he didn't know that footprints were going to be a part of it, or shoe prints or whatever. They clearly weren't thinking that far ahead. So I actually think this is pretty powerful because the shoes soaking in the tub are one of the key pieces of evidence. It's one of those things, one of those pieces of circumstantial evidence that makes you think, aha, they found barbecue sauce, they found blood. What's the first thing you do if you got barbecue sauce and blood all over your shoes? You would wash them. It's obviously a coincidence. It's an unfortunate coincidence for Ralph if it is, because it's the kind of thing that doesn't seem like a coincidence. It seems like an obvious piece of evidence that he did it. But then you hear about how the shoes and the jumpsuit are apparently his smaller, younger brothers. And I don't know. I don't know what to think about it, I guess.
Also, remember, this could just be a red herring, right? It still could have been Ralph, and the shoes are not his. That's the other thing. We've talked about this where all the evidence doesn't necessarily have to fit together, right? Of course, it's a huge coincidence if there are shoes with barbecue sauce soaking to be cleaned after the murder, but it's also possible this is just a total red herring. But I think you're right, Brett. Like, if this was going to be the smoking gun to tie Ralph to the scene, it's kind of falling flat a little bit because of his brother's testimony.
And we're about to have the postal inspector who's going to testify about this. So the way this went down, we've been telling you about defense witnesses. So the prosecution, they had their case. They rested their case, and then you had these rebuttal witnesses, including sort of this testimony about the shoes and everything. And so then Postal Inspector Oswalt is going to come back. He had testified earlier about this, but he's going to come back, and he's going to testify in more depth about this and some other things. So remember, what do we have from the defense? So the way rebuttal works, it's much like it does when you have direct and redirect. So the prosecution puts on its case, the prosecution rests. If the defense then rests, the case is over. There's no more testimony. But if the defense decides to put on witnesses, that can lead to other witnesses by the prosecution. Some of those witnesses can be people who would not otherwise have been able to testify. If certain information comes out in the defense case, you may have heard of opening the door. You may put on a witness who opens the door to previously inadmissible evidence. That didn't really happen here. This was more, we've heard the evidence from the defense, now we're going to put witnesses on to rebut it. And there are two things they want to talk about. They want to talk about the shoes, the barbecue sauce, and all that stuff. And they want to talk about some of the stuff they heard from Ralph's dad. As we said earlier, Ralph Sr. provides an alibi for Ralph Jr. He also talks about the gun. We talked about this gun a lot. According to Ralph, he had a gun, same caliber as the shell casings that were found in the house, but years before, he had actually turned the gun over during a gun buyback at the local fire station. So the prosecution, they want to rebut some of this testimony. So they put on Postal Inspector Oswald, who is a federal law enforcement officer who was only involved in this case because a postal inspector was killed. And he was actually the person who had spoken to Ralph's father the day of the search. And on that day, he asked him the last time he'd seen his son. So remember, the search is basically right after the murders. The murders happen. They learn that Ralph might be involved. They get a search warrant. They go. That day, Ralph Sr. said the morning of the murders, but that he did not know where his son had gone after that. Now, normally, this is sort of this is hearsay, right? So this is Oswald speaking to what Ralph Sr. said when he asked him this question. But because it's rebuttal, because it's challenging testimony of Ralph Sr., it can come in. And he says the last time he'd seen him, according to Ralph Sr., was around 8:30 that morning, and that Ralph was supposed to go to a job interview. This is obviously very different from what we heard from Ralph Sr. before. He was there all day with the exception of a couple very short errands he ran. What Oswald is saying he heard from Ralph Sr. is, saw him in the morning, never saw him again. That is more consistent with the timeline of the murder. He also told him that he asked him about the sneakers soaking in the bathroom, and at that time, Ralph said those were his son, Ralph Jr.'s, not Reuben's. So this is also something different, and this is something that Ralph Sr. had denied in his initial testimony.
Very interesting. You always think that what you say in closer in time to the actual event is true because you haven't had time to see how all the pieces of the investigation fall together. So that's a really interesting piece of information from P.I. Oswald. Now, we've talked a lot about this barbecue sauce. Remember, there were footprints in the restaurant that appear to have been from someone in sneakers who may have stepped in barbecue sauce. In the picture of Mary Santangelo, a container that had apparently been shot was leaking barbecue sauce on the floor. This container was collected for evidence, and at some point, while the prosecution and defense were arguing over how to show the sauce to the jury, someone dropped the bottle and spilled it. You couldn't choreograph that better, to be honest. And the court dryly noted in the records, it's kind of funny, and said, "We just lost the exhibit." In any event, it kind of got the job done better than passing around the sauce because they got to see what the sauce looked like if it had been shot, kind of. The container was broken and it fell on the floor because the barbecue sauce was red in color. And P.I. Oswald said that the sneakers he seized were in a tub soaking in a reddish colored liquid, although he initially thought the substance was blood. But now that we see the barbecue sauce being red, you can see where the inference is that it may have been barbecue that was in the liquid. Interestingly, the defense used the fact that it hadn't been tested to their advantage, saying, "You haven't heard any testimony that any expert who testified he tested those shoes." By the way, this is a pretty common defense strategy to just kind of shed a bunch of doubt on all the things that the prosecution didn't test. Even if it had nothing to do with anything. They'll just point to things like, "You didn't even test for DNA on the blanket that was close to the scene." I mean, the whole point is to get reasonable doubt, right? So I'm not surprised they use this tactic. But put a pin in that because this is going to become important later, that they kind of tease out this whole no expert has tested the shoes. The defense also noted that no one was able to say what kind of footwear any of the victims or other people in the restaurant were wearing, which of course would have been important to rule them out. He also noted that no one took a picture of the shoe print that would have actually been compared to a shoe. So all we have are descriptions based on people's memories rather than being able to make actual comparisons based on photos.
And this is a pretty powerful cross just because that's incompetent of the police not to take pictures of these. this footprint. And you can sort of use that kind of incompetence throughout your defense. They tell you this shoe print's so important. They're telling you these shoes are so important. Well, we'd know a lot more if they'd taken a picture. If they'd taken a picture and you could look at the picture and look at the shoes and it's exactly the same, we'd be in trouble. But they didn't even do that. So we don't even know whether all the police officers who were there, all the other victims who were there, the other people in the freezer, another potential person involved in the shooting, any number of people could have made that shoe print. And they want you to think that it's Ralph's because they found a shoe that's too small, that happened to look dirty, that was soaking in some water, that nobody saved, that this guy who's testifying says kind of looked reddish in color. That's all we got. I mean, you can see how this is pretty good. It's a pretty good cross-examination, even if maybe, it doesn't completely undo the damage of this shoe.
Ralph Sr. said that he had given the .38 caliber he owned to the fire department as part of a gun buyback program. The state called the fire chief, who said that there had been no such program at all. So Ralph Sr.'s caught in a bit of a lie here. And of course, this is important because what gun was used? A .38 caliber.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where undermining Ralph Sr. is really important because if you make it look like he's lying for his son, then it also undermines his alibi. And the alibi is something people point to all the time. If you listen to people talk about this case, if you read about it, if you read the habeas corpus motions that Ralph has filed, they often say things like, convicted of a murder he couldn't have committed because he was somewhere else, confirmed alibi, that kind of stuff. But when you undermine the people who are giving you the alibi, well, that goes a long way to hurting your defense, particularly when your defense is kind of that. If that's basically your defense and the prosecution's shown all this evidence, including one of the victims saying you did it, it's not surprising that when this trial concluded, Ralph was found to be guilty. And I feel like as we've gone through all this evidence, a lot of you out there, maybe even most of you out there, have kind of concluded that he probably did it. I think there's probably a lot of people who are kind of like, I don't know why we're spending so much time on this case. Seems like a slam dunk. But there are things that make you go, I don't know if you guys ever watched Arsenio Hall when you were growing up, but he had a segment called Things That Make You Go, and that's what we have here. And so what we're going to do for the rest of our time is we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this evidence. We're going to tease out some of the things that we've mentioned in the last few episodes, and I will be curious to see when we finish how people feel about this case. So let's start with what makes us think Ralph is guilty. First, there's what happened before the murder. So there's some pretty good evidence about this. You have Donald Blackson, who's testifying that Ralph told him he was going to rob Smokin' Joe's. And then you have Gavin Coates, who testified that Ralph asked if Smokin' Joe's had ever been robbed. That's pretty good. Those are things that make you think when Smokin' Joe's gets robbed, it was probably Ralph. Then there's what happened during the murders, as we've talked about. Whoever robbed the place seemed to have inside knowledge about how it worked. Then there is the statement by Mary that Ralph was the robber, and the statement by Mills that he recognized Ralph possibly through his eyes. Then there's what was found after the murders. You have the shoes soaking in this chlorine or some sort of cleaning that have the red looking color that could be blood or could be barbecue sauce. You have bullet casings matching the gun that was used in the murder. You have the testimony of Burley, who claims he saw Ralph right after the murder with Donald Jackson, and that they admitted what they did and that he saw him with the revolver. And then, of course, you have the testimony of Donald Jackson himself, the accomplice, who says he was the one, he being Ralph, was the one who pulled the trigger. This is sort of all the evidence coming together. And that was a paragraph long, but that's about the state's closing argument.
And that's pretty good. I mean,
that's pretty good.
When you look at that, you're like, okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising that Ralph was convicted. And when you hear all that, you're just kind of like, yeah, next, yeah, this guy's very clearly guilty. I'm pretty convinced that he did it. But like I said, now we've told you the evidence. Let's take a closer look at each piece of the evidence and talk about some things that maybe didn't come out so much in trial.
So Blackson's statement that Ralph said he was going to rob Smokin' Joe's was, of course, very powerful. And then there was Gavin Coates, who said Ralph asked him if the place had ever been robbed. Those two put together, that's great evidence. After all, why would Blackson and Coates lie? Well, money might be a good reason. Turns out the Postal Service doesn't like it when people kill their mailman, and there was a reward for information leading to the arrest of the murderers. Blackson, Coates, and Eric Burley's brother, to name a few, applied for that reward. It's a little unclear who ended up getting what, but what they believed was that they were going to get some part of the reward. Now, that doesn't mean that they are lying, and just because you might get paid doesn't mean you'd lie about a man murdering someone. I mean, truly, rewards are still used in cases today. We know this all the time. You know, the family puts up money for a money reward for information leading to the capture of the perpetrator or an arrest. It's also even possible to say work for the government as an undercover informant, and you can get paid for that work. So this isn't something that's like hush hush and terribly wrong or prosecutorial misconduct or investigative misconduct. But if you thought that Ralph Stokes was guilty anyway, maybe it wouldn't seem like such a big deal to tell a small lie just to ensure that you had part of a hand in making sure that the conviction was delivered in his case. Blackman's testimony actually is particularly fishy, and the cross-examination on Blackman was effective. Although presented as saying that Ralph was going to rob Smokin' Joe's, on cross, Blackman pushed to say that Ralph only said he'd get paid. So not that he was going to rob Smokin' Joe's, but to say, I'm getting paid. Now, what exactly does that mean? And why does it mean he was going to rob Smokin' Joe's? True, his initial statement to the police was far more helpful for the prosecution, but why couldn't he recreate that statement at trial? And it's not just that he missed a few things here or there. He honestly barely says anything at trial other than the money line that Ralph was going to rob Smokin' Joe's. That's it. That's a huge canyon between his statement to police and what he testified. And that's really troubling because you can see how I'm getting paid could be completely innocent. You could also see how that may mean like you're going to get money somehow, but honestly, without that in context, it's not clear that that means anyone's going to rob Smokin' Joe's.
And it's particularly problematic because, as the defense was able to show, Ralph worked at Smokin' Joe's and he'd gone on vacation and apparently had never collected his last check. So it could be something as simple as, I'm going to go down to Smokin' Joe's and get my last check. I'm going to get paid. So I'm going to have some money this weekend. Let's go out, right? I mean, it could be something as simple as that. But when it's turned around and clarified to, I'm going to rob Smokin' Joe's, then suddenly, obviously, it seems much more damning. And this is where we start to go back to the things we talked about in the very first episode about the prosecution in this case and about the accusations that they would manipulate testimony and that the police officers who worked with them would manipulate testimony. And we're going to see some actual examples of that in this case that might shed some light on how this all could have gone down. So, if you look at the police reports in this case, you will notice that they change. In the police reports for two of the survivors, or the only two survivors, the police initially wrote that they were given a general description that might be consistent with Ralph. But at some point, they crossed through these descriptions and replaced them with far more definitive things. For instance, take Mills' report. Mills is the most important survivor. He says in that report that the person who put him in the freezer had the same build as Ralph and similar eyes. So, okay, similar build, similar eyes. That's what he says in the initial police report. But then when you look at the police report, that line is literally crossed through. And written above it is, was the male he knows as Trent, which is Ralph.
That is very, very different.
Very, very different. I mean, basically, initially you have a black male, similar height, and similar eyes, whatever that means. And then you have, it was Ralph. Those are very different things. Now, you can imagine how this could go down just when you're thinking through the sort of psychology of this. So you have the police officer, he writes down initially what he actually says. And then he says something along the lines of, or maybe later on with the prosecution there, they say something like, you say here similar and similar and similar. Can't you just say it was Ralph? I mean, doesn't that all mean it was Ralph? When you say all these things, you put them together, doesn't that just mean it's Ralph? And he's like, yeah, I guess it was Ralph. And then they cross out the first part and they put in the other part. Same thing. We don't have evidence of that with the testimony about him robbing the place. But you could imagine that initially he says, yeah, he said he was going to go down to Smoking Joe's and get paid. And somebody said, so what did he mean by that? Well, I don't know. Could he have meant he's going to rob the place? I mean, yeah, he could have meant that. So are you saying he said he was going to rob the place? Yeah, that's what he said. He was going to rob the place, right? Not that hard to get from going to get paid to rob the place. Like I said, we don't have the direct evidence of that, but we see it in these other reports where vague statements become certain statements. Statements that are sort of moderately helpful to the prosecution become absolutely damning to Ralph. Now, we can't say for certain why these changes were made. It is possible that Mills spontaneously said, never mind, actually it was Ralph and I know it was Ralph. But looking at it and seeing it, police didn't try to hide it. I mean, they crossed it out. It's not like they rewrote the whole report. Could have been laziness more than anything, but we know that these rewrites happened.
And by the way, just so you know, best practices, even if the survivor came back and amended their complaint and it wasn't from any prodding, you're not supposed to cross off the original report. You're supposed to make another police report that says, so-and-so came back to speak to us after having some time to think about it, and now upon reflection believes that it was because it was the person he knows as Trent. That's how you're supposed to do it. Because then you have a record of the changing testimony and you have documented when it happened. So you have, say, a police report, right after the murders happened with their recollection of the similar build. And then maybe it's like 2 weeks later. A lot can happen in 2 weeks. People can get influenced by who they see the police honing in on, who other people suggest to them it may be. So that's the proper way to do it. It's okay to write an amendment to the report. You're not supposed to really cross it off.
And this is another one of those things that is laziness. It kind of shows laziness. We talked about how they didn't take pictures, showed laziness. This is another one. If you'd had a really good defense attorney as opposed to just an adequate one, they would have been hammering this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about the order of things. How this all went down is utterly confusing. The story told by the prosecution during the opening statement is that the workers were put in the freezer and then the shooting started. Then the gun misfired, but then the postal person shows up. They initially let him go, but then they decide to put the mailman in the freezer. But at some point the mailman runs and Ralph shoots him, apparently with the same weapon that had misfired earlier. But Jackson tells a different story. He says that first the postman shows up. They're going to put him in the freezer, but that's when Ralph goes crazy and starts shooting everyone in the freezer. This is when the postal guy runs because he sees everyone getting shot and is like, no, this is not going to happen to me. And Ralph goes after him and shoots him. But once again, what about that supposed misfire? How does it fit into that story? Mills testified that the only time the door opened was when the person shot Mary and Jefferson. Mills doesn't say anything about the gun misfiring. He also said he didn't hear any other shooting. Blessing Game said that the door was opened twice. Once was when everyone was shot, and a second time when the person who did the shooting shot Jefferson again. He said that at this point he heard the gun click twice, indicating a misfire.
You also have the weirdness of the misfire itself. So this is a revolver. And, sometimes this is described as the gun jams, but misfires are something that happens with revolvers. Jams don't really happen. With semi-automatic weapons, we talked about before, where the bullets are coming up through the magazine and the handle, you'll occasionally have a jam where the bullet doesn't go up correctly and now your gun's jammed, you can't get a bullet in, you can't shoot it. Misfire's a little different. I mean, basically what you would have here is he pulls the trigger, there's a bullet in the chamber, but for whatever reason it doesn't fire. And I don't know, it's kind of weird given that they're shooting people, or he is supposedly shooting people in two different places, but there's a gun misfire at some point in the middle, and then does he fix it, or does he just keep pulling the trigger until finally it fires again? I don't know. And the reason this is important is because the misfire is the reason we're given for why Mills survives. Mills, you may recall, is the person who knows Trent. And yet he survives. And that seems a little strange. And it's even led some people to wonder if there was an inside man in the case, but it wasn't Trent. It was Mills. And him surviving was something that was always supposed to happen. And that he was the one who gave the information that the robbers needed. Now, I don't know if there's a whole lot of proof of that, but this story just doesn't quite fit. And nobody's story quite fits. Now, look, it's crazy. People are being robbed. People are being shot. All this other stuff is happening. So you can see how it would get a little loopy. But nevertheless, it's certainly not the clean statement you would want. And it gets worse. So the most damning evidence against Ralph is definitely Mary Figueroa's statement. She's the one who says, it's Trent. Why is he doing this? Powerful statement. The kind of statement that is going to put you in prison. But there's a problem. And it's a pretty big one. Mary is dead. And the only way we know what she said is from Mills. Mills is the only person who tells this story. But Mills is also all over the place on this. First, if Mary told Mills that she knew it was Ralph, he didn't say that on the 911 call. In fact, he told the operator he really couldn't tell him anything about the shooter, including the shooter's race, which is important given that later on he's going to say that he recognized Trent because of his eyes, and he knew it was Trent, and Mary said it was Trent or Ralph. But, in fact, he tells the operator he can't say anything about this, and it actually leads the operator to jokingly say, good eyes, at one point in the call. So you literally have this operator who is handling a call in which 3 people have been murdered, and he's so frustrated with Mills' absolute inability to give any details at all about the robber that he makes a joke about it. That's how bad Mills was. Now, Mills is in shock. He's just been involved in a robbery, so maybe you can say all that. But at some point, it seems like his memory really clears up. And he certainly didn't say, on that 911 call at least, that it was Ralph Stokes, his coworker, his old friend, that he recognized, as he would eventually tell a police officer, which brings us to the second and even more important question.
And that's, how did Mary recognize Trent? Mills told Mary's husband that Mary recognized Ralph's voice. He told the police the same thing, but Mills said he didn't recognize the person's voice, even though he knew Ralph very well and had known him for years. Instead, he said that he recognized his eyes. When Mills took a polygraph, deception was detected on the question of whether or not he recognized the voice of the shooter. But whatever the case may be, what is certain is that Mills' story and Jackson's stories just don't mesh. Jackson said that Mary recognized Trent because he inexplicably raised his mask in her presence. So it would be strange if Mary told Mills that she recognized Ralph because of his voice and not because she saw his whole face without a mask, which is much more identifiable. The Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming, like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy.
All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at progressive.com to join the over 29 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Alice, I've been doing this keto thing, and the reason you know is because if someone's doing keto, they will tell you about it. And I love meat, and I want meat to eat, but it's expensive, and sometimes it's hard to find. And that's where ButcherBox comes in. ButcherBox takes the guesswork out of finding high-quality meat and seafood you can trust. It's 100% grass-fed beef, organic chicken, pork-raised crate-free, and wild-caught seafood. Recently, my wife and I got the variety box, and it had some pork, and it had some beef in it. A couple days ago, we had ribs. Tonight, we had ribeyes, all from ButcherBox. We love it, and you're going to love it too.
Brett, I love that ButcherBox gets delivered exactly with what I want right to my doorstep. There's free shipping for the continental U.S. and no surprise fees. You can choose from a variety of box plan options, from curated to customized, and you can change your plan whenever you want. My family gets to enjoy a range of high-quality meats that are hard to come by at our grocery store at an amazing value. Now, ButcherBox is offering our listeners one of the best deals yet, a 100% grass-fed chuck roast and a whole organic chicken free when you join, plus an additional $20 off your first box. Sign up today at butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute to get a 100% grass-fed chuck roast and a whole chicken free in your first box plus $20 off. That's butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute to get this special deal.
Alice, we're back with one of my favorite ways to pass the time, June's Journey. It's an amazing game. You're going to love it as much as I do. If you're into true crime, which you probably are if you're listening to this show, and you love mysteries, June's Journey is perfect for you. You play as June Parker and investigate beautifully detailed scenes set in the decadent 20s to solve her sister's murder. I love the scenes. I love the mystery. I love traveling around the world to solve many different puzzles, and you're going to enjoy it too. If you reach chapter 5, you're going to hunt down your first international clues in a lush locale. And chapters are added every week, so there's always new characters to meet and great new places to search.
Whether you're a greenhorn detective or Sherlock is your middle name, new investigations await. And June's Journey has tons of fun and unique features to keep you entertained. You can build your very own island estate with expansive gardens and beautiful buildings, or collect scraps of information to fill your photo album. And you can chat and play with or against other players by joining a detective club like us. Pick up where you left off to uncover new secrets or start your investigation today and download June's Journey. Available on Android and iOS mobile devices, as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Guys, I'm so excited to share with you that Thrive Market is my go-to for all of my grocery and household essentials, and the convenience of getting it all quickly shipped to my doorstep is a huge time saver. I've been trying to switch to clean products for my family. That's like clean deodorants and clean bug sprays and clean sunblocks for my kids, and I can find all of these hard to find, clean, environmentally safe items at Thrive Market. And as a Thrive Market member, I can save money on every single order. On average, I save over 30% each time. On top of the massive savings on each order, Thrive Market has a deals page that changes daily, and it gives me cash back on so many brands. And they have a price match guarantee. I love checking out and seeing just how much money I'm saving.
Alice, whether you're looking for certified gluten-free snacks or non-toxic cleaning essentials, you can curate your own shopping experience with the click of a button. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I've been doing keto lately, and it can be hard to find keto snacks in the local grocery store, but not on Thrive Market. I can find my keto noodles, I can find my keto crackers, I can find my keto chips, all right there, delivered to my doorstep. And whatever you are into, you can find it on Thrive Market. So join Thrive Market today and get 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift. Go to thrivemarket.com/prosecutors for 30% off your first order plus a free $60 gift. That's THRIVE market.com/prosecutors. thrivemarket.com/prosecutors. And this is so important. If Mary's statement that we get through meals is not accurate, a huge part of this case falls apart. I mean, a huge part of it is, why have we been talking about this? The person he shot said that it was him. But then you have the co-defendant who is trying to bury Ralph because he wants to get the best deal possible, painting it in the best light possible for the prosecution, which is she didn't have to guess because he had his mask off. She was looking him dead in the face. Of course she recognized him. And then you have Mills, who is saying, oh, she said she recognized his voice. Mills, who is really important because he's the one who delivers the fact that Mary recognized Trent at all, or Ralph. Ralph and Trent are the same person. Just want to remind everybody of that. And what does this make you think? This kind of makes you wonder about going back to the prosecution. And this is the problem with this case. It's really hard to trust the evidence because we have to question the prosecution. And you've got Donald Jackson, who is going to be your most important witness. You got Mills, who is all over the place. One moment, he doesn't even know if the guy's black or white. The next moment, maybe he recognizes him by his eyes, but he doesn't recognize his voice, even though he's known him for years. But he says that Mary recognized his voice. He never mentions that she saw his face. This is not great testimony for the prosecution, and it's easy to see how it's going to be torn apart. But if you can get the co-defendant to say, well, I know how she recognized him because he had his mask off. Easy peasy. She was looking him right in the eyes. But how much can you trust that statement? And how much can you trust it with what Mills is saying? If Mills is saying that she recognized his voice, then that means she didn't tell him, I saw him. I saw his face. And that inconsistency is really problematic when you're building so much of the case on what Mary, who is deceased, says. It sort of highlights so much of the problem with hearsay and why it doesn't come in, because you have this very unreliable narrator in Mills who is telling you a story about what someone else said. We can't ask her about it. And then we got Donald Jackson, who's undermining it even more by making it better. He's making it sound better, but he's undermining the statement itself.
This is also why cross-examination is so important, because it's really hard for people not to deliver things that were said in the past without some sort of shading through their lens of things. Like the I'm going to get paid versus I'm going to rob the place. Sometimes it's not even intentional lying. It's that we all shade how we see the world through our own eyes, and that's how usually we testify about the things that we see. But these are some big, big inconsistencies.
So let's talk more about the description of the person who committed this crime. So Mills, back to Mills, after he got past not being able to tell anything about the shooter, in his statement to the police, he will describe the shooter as between 5'7" and 5'9", a black male, medium build, with light skin. Blessing game, he doesn't testify at trial, but he does give a statement to the police where he describes the shooter as 5'6" to 5'8", so a little bit shorter than what Mills says. Medium build with caramel brown complexion. Now, Ralph is 5'11". So Ralph's almost 6 feet tall. He is a good bit taller than these descriptions. Caveat that was saying that people are often bad at describing people's height. They often get it wrong. But nevertheless, from two different witnesses are telling you that he's, even at the high end, Ralph is 2 inches to 3 inches taller than the person they are describing. It's even worse for Jackson. Jackson's 5'4". He's a short little guy. So he's clearly not the person they are describing. But there is someone who matches this description to a T. And that person is Eric Burley. If it struck you as strange that Ralph and Jackson would complete a robbery that involved a triple murder and then just head on over to some random third party's house and talk about it freely, then you might wonder whether Eric Burley's story is true. And you would be right to be skeptical. Burley had either never met Ralph or knew him only very vaguely, maybe meeting him once before, depending on which of Burley's statements to the police you believe. And yet, if we are to believe his final story, Ralph supposedly feels so comfortable around him that he's willing to discuss a triple murder in front of him. The first crime, by the way, that Ralph has ever committed, a crime that he only committed to cover up the fact he had committed a robbery. But while Burley and Ralph were not close at all, Burley and Jackson were extremely close. In fact, when Jackson went on the run, we talked about that earlier, that Jackson, he went on the run, he was on the lam for a little while. It was Burley who went with him. So the two of them went on the run. Not Jackson and Ralph, but Jackson and Burley. They stole a car together. They left Pennsylvania heading to New Jersey. And in sort of a bizarre twist, Jackson actually disguised himself as a woman in this process. So you have Burley and Jackson on the run, and Jackson disguising himself as a woman. And that stolen car, the one they stole to go on the lam together, it's likely not the only crime they committed together. In 1980, Jackson was fingered for a robbery he committed with an accomplice. That accomplice was described as 15 to 18, 5'7", medium build, medium complexion. The same description as the shooter at Smokin' Joe's, and a description that fit Burley. And there's no question that Burley, like Jackson, was someone willing to use violence. In October 1982, Burley was arrested and convicted of shooting a man 4 times. And what weapon did he use? A revolver. Much later, the defense would actually discover that the police sought an arrest warrant for Burley for his role in the robbery. The prosecution would decline to issue that arrest warrant and use the fact that they were not pursuing him to encourage the testimony of Burley and Burley's brother, both of which were critical, and for which Burley's brother would later seek a reward. This fact was not disclosed to the defense.
Whoa. So that's a lot of powerful evidence against Burley, who we've been kind of suspect at this entire time. That might beg the question of whether there was a third man. The 2 survivors described one of the robbers as being 5'10" or 5'11", who was at the restaurant but didn't shoot anyone or say anything. This person was not the shooter and in fact was said to have the automatic. Neither Burley nor Donald Jackson, in particular, given how short he was, fit the description of this 5'11" person. But Ralph does. So maybe was Ralph part of the robbery, but he wasn't the shooter. The defense would later learn that a man named Eric Burl had told police that he'd seen Jackson in the company of 2 men. Jackson was armed with a revolver that matched the description of the one used in the robbery. Burl told police that Jackson had told him the 3 of them had knocked off Smokin' Joe's. Burl's statement was supported by one key detail. He said the next day he saw Jackson dressed like a woman. He told him that he was on the run because the feds were now involved. Now, most people didn't know it, but when Jackson went on the run, like Brett just said, he disguised himself as a woman. This wasn't like all over the news or anything. So this piece of evidence actually lends a lot of credence to Burl's statement. Here's the important thing. Burl's statement was never turned over to the defense.
So we're starting to see a pattern here. We're seeing people who are changing their stories. We are seeing people's police reports that are changing. We are seeing evidence in favor of Ralph that's not turned over to him, and it doesn't end there. Let's talk about the shoes again. Coming back to the shoes, another powerful piece of evidence. You got barbecue sauce and blood on the floor. You have a shoe print in the barbecue sauce and the blood. You have a shoe that's soaking, that has it's red water and everything else. So at trial, we noted that the defense tried to rebut the suggestion that the shoes found at Ralph's house, that they had blood and barbecue sauce on them, in part by noting that they had never been tested. But in fact, they had been tested. Apparently, yeah. Apparently, the postal inspector, who we discussed earlier, had the shoes tested. And the shoes came back negative for both blood and barbecue sauce. Now, who knew they could test for barbecue sauce? But neither blood nor barbecue sauce were found on the shoes. And I am sure you were all shocked to learn that neither of these tests were ever turned over to the defense, even though the prosecution had the test results, and even though the shoes themselves were a cornerstone of their prosecution. And everything we've told you, particularly the 3 things, the 2 statements that weren't turned over, the tests that weren't turned over, have raised the specter of a Brady violation in this case. Most of you know what Brady violations are, but just to remind you, the prosecution has a duty to turn over evidence that is exculpatory and material to the defense. Exculpatory, it can be something that shows that you're not guilty sort of directly, but it also can be things that would impeach the testimony of a witness against you. Basically, something you can use in your defense really should be turned over to the defense.
Especially if it's testing done on a piece of evidence that is a cornerstone to the prosecution's story.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is simply no question that this evidence should have been turned over by the prosecution. when you get into this in sort of an appeal type situation, I think you would basically have to admit, yes, this should have been turned over, and try and point to all the other evidence against Ralph. But let's step back for a second. Let's look at that litany of evidence that I went through at the very beginning, of the things that make you go, the things that made it seem so certain that Ralph did it. So you have Blackson and Coates' testimony, but Blackson's testimony is inconsistent with what he told the police. It seems to be shaky and unsure. He really can't give any details. And, oh, by the way, there's a reward involved. The same thing for Coates. What you have during the murder is maybe you have someone with inside knowledge, and I'll return to the inside knowledge in a second. You have the statement from Mills, but it seems inconsistent and all over the place, depending on when he's telling people things, whether it's the 911 operator or the police or the prosecution later on. And remember, we have an example of Mills' statement given to the police that is vague, that was amended to make it more clear and more damning to Ralph. You have the shoes soaking, but now we have tests of the shoes that weren't turned over, in addition to the evidence that the defense actually put on about how they were actually too small for Ralph. You have bullet casings matching a revolver, but all of a sudden we learn that one of the key prosecution witnesses, Eric Burley, likes to rob people with a revolver, and not only likes to rob people with a revolver, but likes to rob people with Donald Jackson with a revolver.
And pulls triggers.
Right, and is a trigger puller.
And that's a big deal, right? It is a big deal, and we see with our criminals, just because you carry a gun doesn't mean you necessarily pull the trigger. A lot of criminals actually commit their crimes holding guns because people are afraid of guns, but they've never actually pulled the trigger. So to be a trigger puller puts you up to the next level.
You've got, in this case, some really interesting testimony. Some of it that came in and some of it that didn't. But remember, from Mills and Blessingame, who are our two survivors, and I actually don't think Mills is involved. I think Mills is, doing the best he can. You have a description of one person who's involved in this robbery who is between 5'6" and 5'9", and another person who is around 5'11". Neither of those describe someone who we absolutely know was there, which is Donald Jackson. Donald Jackson's 5'4". I don't think you would get that wrong. Like I said, he's a pretty short guy. Ralph is 5'11", but remember, from the statement of the survivors, the person who was 5'11" didn't do anything. Didn't have a gun, or he had a gun. He had the semi-automatic at one point, but didn't shoot anybody. And then you have the perfect description for Eric Burley, the third party, the guy who, by the way, do you remember the whole barber situation where you have the barber who testifies that Ralph was one of the people with Donald Jackson? That barber didn't know Ralph. And he didn't know Burley either. It's quite possible that that person that was with Donald Jackson that day actually was Burley. Or the other possibility, and what I actually think happened in this case, I think there were three people there. I think Donald Jackson was there. I think Eric Burley was there. And I think Eric Burley was the shooter. I think Eric Burley is the man with the revolver. Donald Jackson will later say, the boy went crazy and started shooting everybody. Burley at the time was only 16 years old. Ralph was a little bit older. He was almost 20. Now look, could just be a colloquialism, or Donald Jackson could actually be talking about someone who was much younger who committed this crime. Donald Jackson, I think, had a lot of affection for Burley. I think he possibly looked at him like a younger brother. And when he knew the walls were closing in on him, he chose not to finger him. Instead, I think he fingered Ralph, who I actually do think was involved in this. I think Ralph got caught up in this somehow. He was the inside man. That was the information that these two criminals, these two robbers, these two guys who were willing to shoot people needed to rob the store. And I think that Ralph went along with them and was there while these other people committed the crime. That does not absolve Ralph of guilt. And obviously, it wouldn't mean that Ralph, his conviction would still be unjust to a certain extent, but he still would have gone to prison if that were the case. But he certainly wouldn't be on death row, just like Donald Jackson. It would have put him in a position where he couldn't really admit that, because if he comes out and says that, then he really is dooming himself, particularly because of Donald Jackson. And it really puts him in a difficult spot. And this is something I think is important when you look at cases like this. Sometimes people who are convicted wrongly actually did do something, but didn't do the thing they were accused of. In fact, maybe even most of the time, people who wind up in these situations are sort of not guilty of the thing that they're accused of, but maybe were somehow involved. I think he had a very minor involvement. I think had this been known at the time, had this case been properly handled, had Burley been convicted, I think Ralph would be out by now. I think he would have been the least culpable person of these three people who were involved. That's my theory looking at the evidence. It is possible Ralph's not involved in all, but I will say this. I think Ralph's alibi is not very good. I think his parents are obviously covering for him. And I think there is truth in the idea that the three men went back to Burley's place to split the money. I think that happened. But I think the context that we're given is not accurate. And I think at the end of the day, Ralph is not guilty of triple murder.
Yeah, Brett, I think as the facts kind of bear out, it was possible to convict Ralph because he was there. And I think that may have been the case, but I think I agree with you there. He doesn't appear to have been the shooter. It would be very suspect if Eric Burley had nothing to do with this. It goes beyond belief that these two guys would go to Burley's house and openly argue in front of a third party who doesn't know the details of what just happened. Because remember, if the plan was just to have a robbery, and even if your friend Burley knew about the robbery, he didn't know you were going to kill a bunch of people, and not just one or two, but three people. That's a big deal. And so to fight in front of him, and then for Ralph, who barely knows Burley, to hand him both the murder weapon and the clothes to get rid of, but somehow keep the bullet casings as a souvenir, just doesn't really make any sense. But when you add Burley as the third person as in this robbery, that makes a lot more sense. And like you said, I think Ralph, this is tough, and I don't know what the motivation was for the prosecution. You can, of course, jump to all bad will, but tunnel vision is a real thing. I don't know if that's what happened here. I don't know if, it's very powerful to have the co-robber point fingers so strongly at Stokes. It might be difficult to point fingers at someone else in the prosecution, but this is a hard one. This is a hard one because it's not completely obvious on its face, and I think it's not obvious on its face because I do think Ralph was involved with the robbery.
And I think the prosecution fell into the same trap it's easy to fall in with this case. When you just look at it surface level, it seems pretty obvious. And I think there was a notion of, look, this is a great case we got. We got tons of evidence. We got great people who are going to testify. Let's not look too deep. We don't want to know. I think there was a we don't want to know with the prosecution. I think they thought Ralph was involved. They may have even believed he was the shooter. There's no way that they didn't think Eric was involved, just like the police did. There was a reason the police wanted an arrest warrant for him, because I think the police believed he was involved. But at some point, the decision was made, we're going with it was these two guys. It was these two guys. We're not going to look any deeper on this. We'll get Burley later, which they did because he was shooting other people. And they went forward with it. Burley was 100% involved in this. In my view, either Ralph is completely innocent, which I don't really believe, just because it's hard to frame somebody, and to just pick a random guy. I mean, for all they knew, Ralph was on jury duty that day. You know what I mean? It's just the notion that you could pick someone to frame them and it works out that actually they don't have a good alibi and they very well could have been involved. And there's all this sort of circumstantial evidence kind of pointing to them. And there's people willing to say they said something about robbing the place beforehand. That's a lot of dominoes that have to fall. And you can try and say, well, it was probably the prosecution just doing it all. I mean, I can see the prosecution shading things like we've talked about, pushing people to say certain things, leaving out evidence, hiding evidence, all that. But building the whole thing just from the ground up, that I find a little bit harder to believe. But anyway, either Ralph is completely innocent, he wasn't involved at all, and it was just Donald Jackson and Burley, which actually doesn't fit, I don't think, with the evidence and with the eyewitness testimony, or it was the three of them, and Ralph wasn't the shooter. Those are the two things that I think are most likely. I don't think it's very likely at all that Ralph was the shooter. And I think this is a case, look, we're doing the best we can with a 40-year-old trial that is hilarious. I mean, the judge in this case was a complete joker. The police would get off the stand, and outside the presence of the jury, he would just run the police down. He was like, there goes another waste of taxpayer dollars right there, completely incompetent. I mean, he hated the cops, and he was always making fun of the prosecution. I mean, it was kind of funny, but you've got this crazy case from 40 years ago where both sides are quoting the Bible in the closing, where you've got hidden evidence and suppressed statements. That's all you have. We're not in a really great position to look in this deeply, but the people who are the people in Pennsylvania, the people in the Philadelphia DA's office, the people in the Conviction Integrity Unit. And this seems to me to be a case that doesn't get a lot of attention. There's not been a lot of media focus on it, but it is a case that those people should look at. And if at the end of the day, those people look at this case and they're like, no, those crazy podcasters are wrong. He clearly did it for all these reasons. There were no Brady violations. Okay, that's fine. I'll accept that. But what I don't think we can accept is not having someone take a deeper look at this case. A lot of cases of supposedly innocent people that are really famous don't really deserve a lot of attention. This one does, and it's my hope that this case will be re-examined sometime in the near future. People are dying. Mills is dead, as far as I know. Donald Jackson's still in prison, but he is obviously much older. And you have Ralph, who was 19 years old when he was arrested 41 years ago. He has lost a lot of his life, and if it turns out that he's either innocent or that's an appropriate sentence for his involvement, then he needs to be released. So that's my hope, is that someone will take a harder look at this case.
Yeah, we're limited to, what's out there. We're not investigating this case, and there's enough questions and certainly enough things that make you go, about this case to take a deeper look. And I appreciate Maggie pushing us to look at that second look, because upon first glance, it was like, yeah, it looks pretty locked in. But there are certainly questions to be answered here.
I mean, when I first looked at this, I was like, Mag, I don't know if we can cover this case, because this seems so obvious to me. He's guilty. But the more you look, and the more you look at those statements, and the more you look at the evidence that was left out, and the more you look at the contradictory testimony, it seems so beautiful, but it's like a paper mache thing, right? Like, it looks pretty on the outside, but it's really hollow on the inside. And that's what I think about this case. I think it's hollow on the inside. And I think once you start poking at it, all of a sudden it starts falling apart. So those are our thoughts on this case. We've given you guys a lot of information over the course of 4 episodes. We kind of set you up to think he's obviously guilty before we started poking holes. So curious to know how many of you, after listening to this episode, have other questions, or if you think, no, we're reaching and he's actually very guilty. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you to all of you watching on YouTube, and to those of you who've received this episode early and ad-free on Patreon. Well, Alice, I know you're barely making it. We really appreciate you working through the episode today, but do you have anything left to say before we sign off?
No, I think that this was worth the 4 episodes, and I hope you guys enjoyed it and went on the roller coaster ride with us, because that was kind of the ride that we went on in looking into the case, ups and downs. But it's a worthy case, and hopefully someone will really look deeply into this.
So next week, we have one of my favorite true crime cases. So we've been working on it for a while. I'm looking forward to doing it. Should be, maybe a 3-parter. I don't know exactly how many. At some point, there will be a deep, barely relevant discussion of about 500 years of history in this. So I know you all are really looking forward to that. But it's one of my favorites, so I hope you guys will enjoy it. It's a rabbit hole you're going to go down. A case with a lot of mystery, and a case that is not solved to this day. And who knows, maybe we can help shed some light on it. So you got that to look forward to. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. So let's talk about Mary Figueroa and Mills. Mary, her statement is really just one of the most important things that happens in this. Is her name Figueroa or is it Santangelo?
Oh, that's a good point. I don't know.
I don't know where I would have gotten Figueroa for name one. Figueroa.
I thought it was Figueroa.
Why did I get Santangelo?
I don't know. It's the Santangelo.
Santangelo is...
That's somebody else.
That's the... I just screwed it up. That's the mailman. So Mary Figueroa is correct.
All month long on Pluto TV, stream the biggest Tyler Perry movies free. Watch your favorites like Medea's Witness Protection and Medea's Big Happy Family. Join Tyler Perry as he goes on a couples retreat with Sharon Leal in Why Did I Get Married? Or Idris Elba and Gabrielle Union in the Tyler Perry directed film Daddy's Little Girls. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows. Available on live and on demand. Download the free Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices and start streaming now. Pluto TV. Drop in, watch free.